Girl Interrupted, from an Emancipation of Women. We are privileged and honored to have with us in the second session as our speaker, Dr. Robin Field, Professor of English, Pennsylvania, USA, King's College. And I would invite our head of the department, Dr. Shukanto Dash, to say a few words as an introductory address.
Okay, thank you, Isa. Good afternoon from PCM Mahavidyalaya to all our guest participants and our speaker, Dr. Robin Field. Now, it's very interesting for us really to host such an important and international scholar for our webinar. Now, this is the second, talk in this webinar, and it's a matter of pleasure and privilege for me to really host and introduce Dr. Robin Field to our esteemed participants here. Now, Dr. Robin E. Field is Professor of English at King's College, a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, USA. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors in English literature from Cornell University and a PhD in English from the University of Virginia. Dr. Field runs the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching at King's College and is the managing editor of the journal South Asian Review. She has published essays on Jhumpa Lahiri, Yad Akhtar, Chandra, Alice Walker, and other authors. And she published interviews with Bharti Mukherjee, Chitra Divakarani, and Diana Abu Jaber. Her first book, Transforming Diaspora, Communities Beyond National Boundaries, was released in 2011 by Farley Dickinson University Press and is an edited collection of essays on new ways of understanding diaspora and cultural studies. Her second book will be released this month by Clemson University Press in the USA and Liverpool University Press in the UK. It is entitled Writing the Survivor, the Rape Novel in Late 20th Century American Fiction. Her talk today explores the argument made in writing The Survivor. And let me just show you the flyer of her book that is due for publication this month. And what she has done in this book is to explore a new genre in literature, that is the rape novel. So it would be a very interesting topic for us to really, discuss and talk on this particular new emerging field that she will be enlightening us with her lecture. So let us now welcome our speaker, Dr. Robin Field, and let us enjoy her talk. So now over to you, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm very honored to be with you from the other side of the world. It's very early in the morning here in Pennsylvania, so it is a great way to start my day to be here with you. Thank you. So thank you especially to Dr. He and I have been friends for a long time, and I appreciate that he wanted to speak to you today. As Dr. Das noted, my book is coming out this month, and I will give you an overview of what I talk about in the book. So I would like to start out, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. I'm not always the best with technology here, but I'd like to start out with a text that has been really important for American literature. So let me bring this down here. So Gone with the Wind. I'm sure many of you know this film. And it's also a very long novel by Margaret Mitchell. So I'm going to start out by talking about this film and this movie poster in particular. And then I'm going to see if I can't show you a clip as well from the film to illustrate what I'm talking about. So picture, if you will, what is widely regarded as one of the most romantic scenes in American literature and film. A lovely young woman storms away from her lover after they quarrel. The handsome, mustachioed man rushes after her, takes her into his arms, and kisses her passionately. Scooping her into his arms, he carries her up a staircase into the dark room above for a night of passionate lovemaking. This famous scene between Rhett Butler and Scarlett O'Hara is captured in the movie poster, which here you can see, for Gone with the Wind. This movie came out in 1939, where the actor Clark Gable holds Vivien Leigh in his arms. His face is serious, almost scowling, as he stares into her eyes. You can see how his white shirt is unbuttoned and his lips are close to hers, and how Vivien Leigh's dress has slipped off her shoulders and left her shoulders and neck bare, and her hair is loose and her eyes are closed. So this pose is very sensual, it's very anticipatory. The background, let's look also at the background. It has the reds and the yellows that evoke the flames of a raging fire. This poster emphasizes the passion between Rhett and Scarlett, for which the film and novel are well known. And undoubtedly, this image has inspired the covers of many romance novels. Vivien Leigh's red dress ties this iconic image of Rhett and Scarlett to the scene in the film. And so now I'm going to see if I can show you this scene in the film. It's about 2 minutes long.
The comic figure in all this is the long-suffering Mr. Wilkes. Mr. Wilkes, who can't be mentally faithful to his wife and won't be unfaithful to her technically. Why doesn't he make up his mind?
Wait, you...
Observe my hands, my kid. I could tear you to pieces with them. And I'd do it if it'd take Ashley out of your mind. But it wouldn't. So I'll remove him from your mind forever this way. I'll put my hands so, one on each side of your head. And I'll smash your skull between them like a walnut. That'll block him out.
Take your hands off me, you drunken fool.
You know, I've always admired your spirit, my dear. Never more than now when you're cornered.
I'm not cornered. You'll never corner me, Red Butler, or frighten me. You've lived in dirt so long you can't understand anything else. You're jealous of something you can't understand. Good night.
Jealous, am I? Yes, I suppose I am. Even though I know you've been faithful to me all along. How do I know? Because I know Ashley Wilkes and his honorable breed. They're gentlemen. That's more than I can say for you or for me. We're not gentlemen. And we have no honor, have we? It's not that easy, Scarlett. You turned me out while you chased Ashley Wilkes, while you dreamed of Ashley Wilkes. One night you're not turning me out.
All right. Let me unshare my screen here. Okay, am I back?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, good. So now we've seen the poster, we have seen this scene, and I will talk about it. So, as you have just seen, Scarlett, wearing that red dress, stalks away from Rhett, only to have him sweep her against him with a strong arm around her waist. When he kisses her, you'll notice that she was beating her fists against him and against his chest, but he says, "This is one night you're not turning me out." Scarlett gasps as he scoops her into his arms, and she continues to beat her fists against his chest and twist her body as Rhett carries her up the stairs into the darkness above. This memorable scene epitomizes the cultural confusion about sex and rape that permeates literature, film, and other media in the early and mid-20th century in the United States. While the movie poster emphasizes the passion and romance between Rhett and Scarlett, the scene from the film offers a much more complicated depiction of sex, one rooted in violence and the struggle for power and control. The quarrel that precedes the staircase scene, as you saw, is about Scarlett's obsession with another man named Ashley Wilkes, and Rhett's frustration that Scarlett has rejected him, he's her husband, in her heart and in her bed. Rhett, who has been drinking heavily, confronts Scarlett about her feelings for Ashley, and when he tries to leave her chair, he shoves her down and stands behind her. And so you'll remember those words that he was speaking as he had her head in his hands and was squeezing her head. He was talking about how he could tear her to pieces with her hands, but since that wouldn't take Ashley out of her mind, I'll put my hands so on each side of your head, and I'll smash your skull between them like a walnut, and that will blot him out. So we saw how Vivien Leigh, the actress playing Scarlett, registered fear at first as Clark Gable's hands dig into her scalp and forehead. And in the novel, we hear that Scarlett was looking into the face of a stranger, a drunken, drawling voiced stranger. Scarlett wrenches away from her husband and attempts to leave the room, but Rhett follows and shoves her against the wall. Again, Scarlett tries to move away from her husband, but once she reaches the bottom of the stairs, the infamous exchange occurs, and Scarlett is taken against her will up the stairs. This so-called most romantic of scenes, in fact, depicts rape, both in the film and in the novel, preceded by a husband mentally terrorizing and physically battering his wife. As Eve Sedgwick notes in Between Men, English Literature and Male Homosocial Desire, she says, "Gone with the Wind is not a novel that omits enforced sexuality. We are shown one actual rape in fairly graphic detail, but when it is white hands that scrabble on white skin, its ideological name is blissful marriage." Yet for many viewers of this film, this scene is wildly romantic. Scarlett is supposedly swept away by Rhett, and his passion cannot be overcome by her token resistance. Further complicating the scene is the next shot, which this clip didn't show, but we see Scarlett waking up in bed the next morning, her hair provocatively tousled, and a satisfied smile on her lips. This is a woman who thoroughly enjoyed a night of passionate lovemaking, an image quite at odds with the struggling woman who pummeled the man with her fists as she is taken up the stairs. The novel, too, contains this pattern of violent force turned into romantic seduction. As Rhett carries her up the stairs, Scarlett is terrified. And the author, Margaret Mitchell, writes, "He hurt her, and she cried out, muffled, frightened." Yet once he begins to kiss her, Scarlett's fear turns to passion instead. And here's a long quote from the novel. "Suddenly, she had a wild thrill, such as she had never known. Joy, fear, madness, excitement, surrender to arms that were too strong, lips too bruising, fate that moved too fast. For the first time in her life, she had met something stronger than she, someone she could neither bully nor break, someone who was bullying and breaking her. Somehow, her arms were around his neck and her lips trembled beneath his, and they were going up, up into the darkness again, a darkness that was soft and swirling and all enveloping." Scarlett's fear of Rhett dissolves into excitement and desire when he ignores her refusal. Once she realizes that he will have sex with her, regardless of her consent, Scarlett experiences hitherto unimaginable passion. That the sex is violent rather than tender heightens the eroticism for Scarlett. Here's another quote. "He had humbled her, hurt her, used her brutally through a wild, mad night, and she had gloried in it. But stronger than shame was the memory of rapture, of the ecstasy of surrender." So indeed, this night proves a turning point in their marriage for Scarlett, as she finally realizes that she loves her husband, Rhett, not this other man, Ashley. For Scarlett, forced violent sex offers not only erotic pleasure, but the avenue to romantic love and domestic bliss as well. Gone with the Wind offers perhaps the most well-known depiction of unrecognized marital rape in early 20th century American culture. This rape vanishes from the novel and the film, and from much of our American cultural memory of Gone with the Wind, to be replaced by the more prevalent cultural constructions of rape and sexual violence that permeated American sensibilities until the early 1970s. This scene utilizes a plethora of myths that obfuscate the pain and terror of rape. So here are some of the myths. Scarlett likes being overpowered by Rhett, and the rape myth this evokes is that all women secretly crave rape. Although she resisted at first, Scarlett enjoys herself, and the myth is, if you're going to be raped, you may as well enjoy it. Rhett was overcome by his passion for his wife, and the myth is, men cannot control their biological urge to have sex. And Scarlett is not raped because Rhett is her husband. And the myth is, a husband cannot rape his wife. The prominence of Gone with the Wind as a cultural artifact helped to inscribe an understanding of rape in the American psyche that was stripped of pain, fear, and degradation for the woman involved. In this scene, rape was simply rough sex, and rough sex was, in turn, posed as the height of eroticism. These understandings of rape appeared throughout American literature in the mid-20th century, from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in 1952 to Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in 1961, and Norman Mailer's An American Dream in 1965. Both Miller and Mailer, for example, present as normative the view that all women enjoy pain, degradation, and humiliation. And as their novels were touted for their sexual freedom, Their graphic representations of forced and violent sex presume, and indeed encourage, voyeuristic enjoyment on the part of readers. In the groundbreaking feminist work of feminist literary theory from 1970, Sexual Politics, Kate Millay convincingly describes how Mailer and Miller instead promote a repressive gender politics. Because of its efficacy in functioning as a trope for contested social and cultural agendas, rape becomes sundered from its original signification of the violation of a human body. So I'm going to pause here and just comment that I'm setting up how in American literature and culture, rape wasn't about the violation of a person and the humiliation and the psychological pain and fear. Instead, it was pornographic and meant to be enjoyed by readers or the watchers of films, etc. This is what I will argue that the novels that come after fight against. So, how does this end? In 1970, a new genre of American fiction arose to combat the twisted notions of rape and sexual violence. I call this genre the rape novel. The rape novel arose in the wake of the women's liberation movement, with the dual mandates of feminist activism and the literary recuperation of female experiences. Critics such as Sabine Silka and Pamela Barnett have argued convincingly that representations of rape in earlier American fiction foremost signify concerns about rape, race, class, and nationality. Building upon this work, I demonstrate how African American, Asian American, Latinx, Native American, and Anglo-American women in the 1970s and early 1980s collectively challenged the traditional troping of sexual violence that erased female subjectivity and agency. The rape novel foregrounds the victim and her story in a textual centering which restores her dignity and self-worth. It also develops new narratological strategies for portraying violent, disturbing subject matter in a constructive and informative manner. In bringing together many of the key women's texts of the last decades of the 20th century, the rape novel demonstrates the centrality of sexual assault to women's fiction of this era in American literature. Ultimately, my book, Writing the Survivor, offers a radical reconsideration of the late 20th century American novel. First, by underscoring the importance of women's activism upon its form and content. And secondly, by offering the rape novel as evidence for the critical necessity of reading across ethnic traditions. Writing the Survivor rescripts the critical conversation about the representation of rape made by other critics by prioritizing the bodily experience of rape. So many critics have been skeptical of the very possibility of understanding a victim's experience and then representing that experience because of the strong influence of deconstruction as literary theory and other theories of textual instability from the 1980s and 1990s. I argue that this new genre, the rape novel, offers a bold new understanding of the relationship between form and content in the late 20th century in American literature. The rape novel inextricably connects formal methods to social history and textual representation with bodily experience. Feminist thought provides crucial in shaping not only the content and the themes, but also the form and the structure of the novel, while the physical and psychological manifestations of traumatic experience upon the body also offer a sort of narratological template for portraying sexual violence. So here's a key aspect of my argument in the book. Writing the Survivor reveals the portrayal of rape as rape to be an inter-ethnic imperative. And I use this phrase often, rape as rape, because as I have just talked about, instead, rape has often been used to signify something else. All right, so previously, instead of meaning a violated person, usually a violated woman's body, a woman's mind, it was about other issues. And the rape novel recenters the person who has been harmed. So let us now think about the inaccurate and misleading representations of rape and how they were challenged by the work of second wave feminism. So this couldn't come out of nowhere, this challenge, right? It needed the work of feminist activists in the 1970s and also of other texts. So you'll recall that the skewed representations of rape were told through this perspective, not of the victim. Instead, they were told through the perspective of the perpetrator himself, or sometimes by bystanders at the scene, and these bystanders were usually unsympathetic. Because the victim's experience was elided, was taken away in previous textual representations, the earliest rape novels introduced the consciousness of the victim to readers, many readers, for the first time. I demonstrate how women began portraying rape, as a violent and non-consensual act, once second wave feminists began to challenge rape myths through consciousness raising sessions, publications, and public activism. So let's talk about the activism and the early texts that helped to challenge these skewed depictions of rape previously. The newfound understanding of the victim's psyche in rape fiction from the 1970s is derived from two main sources: the literature of the anti-rape movement and autobiographical accounts of sexual assault. So I draw upon, in this chapter that talks about these sources, social manifestos, polemical books, and the work of a historian named Maria Bavacqua, who wrote a book called Rape on the Public Agenda, which documents the trajectory of anti-rape activism. The rhetoric of this social movement, especially the nonfiction and also the first-person narration in testimonies and autobiographies, inspired rape fiction. So some of you may have heard of the book called Against Our Will, written by Susan Brown Miller and published in 1976. So this is a very long book. It's over 500 pages. And Susan Brown Miller traces the history of rape, as she describes it in this book, from earliest days up until the present. She talks about the connection of race and rape. She talks about how rape has been used as a tool of war. And importantly, she talks to victims of rape and asks them to tell their stories. So she uses newly discovered facts about sexual assault. And she also creates theories that explain why rape happens. So these are two really persuasive ways to challenge the previous understanding of rape, to explain using new facts how often it happens, how it happens to women of all different backgrounds, how the perpetrators, the rapists themselves, are from all different backgrounds. And then also the idea of patriarchal oppression. So the idea that men use rape in order to stay on top of the power structure. This was a very controversial part of her book because she basically said all men use rape to oppress all women. And of course, we hear even today, not all men use rape, not all men do this or do that, all right? This idea that because some people don't do something, the premise is flawed. And that, of course, is not true. So I examine these diverse texts that contributed to the emergence of the rape novel, looking at transcripts of consciousness raising sessions, these groups in the 1960s and 70s of women sitting together and talking about their lives in a way that women didn't do previously. You know, in American culture, the idea of talking about one's marriage, talking about one's sex life with a husband, talking about how you feel about being, say, a wife and a mother, was not encouraged. Women were supposed to be happy in the home and stay home and not critique their lives, be glad to have what they have. So these consciousness raising sessions allowed women to realize they had shared experiences of oppression, whether they were married or unmarried. I also look at the memoirs of Maya Angelou and Billie Holiday, the jazz singer. Both of these women discuss being raped as children, and their voices, because they were very public figures. You've probably heard of Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. This is the book that I look at. And Billie Holiday's memoir. As public figures, they were very influential in showing that not only could women talk about being raped, but they shouldn't be ashamed about it. It wasn't something that was their fault. It was a crime committed against them. So let's turn to the novels themselves. I'm going to talk generally about a few of the novels in each of the decades of the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. And I'm also going to look closely at two novels in particular. So some of the titles of these rape novels are coming up very soon. The first rape novels, written in the 1970s, struggled with the literary legacy of the rape trope and societal acceptance of rape myths. These texts acknowledge that rape indeed may signify issues of race, class, or nationality, but they also demand that rape be understood as the violation of a woman's person. These novels portray rape as rape, allowing the reader to understand the violence enacted upon a victim's body, the brutality impressed upon her mind, and the devastating personal and communal repercussions of the act. Rape is no longer merely a signifier for various power struggles between men. Instead, it is returned to the province of those women who suffer the physical and psychological consequences. This recentering is achieved through the unflinchingly realistic portrayal of sexual violence on the page. So in this chapter I write on the 1970s, I look at four novels in particular. Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye from 1970, Marilyn French's The Women's Room from 1976, Gail Jones's Corregidora from 1975, and Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior from 1976. So 2 African-American women, 1 white woman, and 1 Asian-American woman, all of them talking about rape in a very different way than had happened previously in American literature. So what do they do differently? First off, they challenge the traditional readerly reaction of voyeuristic pleasure. So as we saw with Gone with the Wind, we're supposed to see this as romantic rather than as forced. And even Scarlett herself shifts to thinking of this as very romantic instead of being rape. So instead, It is replaced with feelings of shock and horror, which are, of course, much more appropriate for this subject matter. The first rape novels offer a new script for the rape story, one that focuses on the experience of the victim. Now, this may seem very logical at this point because we're 50 years away from the 70s. And it seems reasonable to focus on the victim of rape and to feel sorrow and sympathy for that person, all right? But this was brand new in the 1970s to say that rape was not sexy, rape was not enjoyable, instead that it was painful and traumatic. So the other important thing about the 1970s texts in American literature is, well, two things. One thing is that the stories are told by bystanders. They are not told by the victims themselves. It's important that they're not told by the perpetrators either, right? As previously in, say, Norman Mailer or Henry Miller, the man was the one describing how this was a great experience for women. Instead, the bystander sees what's happening and feels terrible and is learning themselves that this is not a good experience. So that's an improvement, of course. Now, another important aspect, though, is that these texts did not know what to do with the rape victim after her experience. That is, life after rape, all right? So if we think about Toni Morrison's character, Pecola Breedlove, she's a young girl, she's raped by her father, she's impregnated by him, and Toni Morrison has this character go insane. She can't imagine how this young girl could deal with her life after having lived this experience, so Pecola goes insane. Another character in Maxine Hong Kingston's novel, The Woman Warrior, it's told by a relative later. This is a woman in China who is raped and becomes pregnant. And so when she has her child, she jumps into a well and takes the baby with her. So she kills herself because she can't imagine how she would be able to live and the baby as well. So death, insanity, and then the last strategy that these novels use, you can see in Marilyn French's novel, The Women's Room. Her character, a young girl, a college student who is raped, basically gets written out of the novel. She has this experience, she has a terrible time, and then she gets sent away and no one ever sees her again. So death, insanity, or disappearance. So it's an improvement in the 1970s to see that rape happens, but it's also not resolved of what happens afterward. And that's where we get to the 1980s. So a central prerogative of rape fiction of the 1980s is to underscore the legitimacy of the traumatic experience by providing in-depth accounts of the assault and its physical and psychological repercussions. Novels such as Alice Walker's The Color Purple, Sandra Cisneros's The House on Mango Street, and Bharti Mukherjee's Jasmine all contain harrowing rape scenes that use their detail to emphasize the fact that rape engenders deep psychological consequences. I map the depth of emotional damage incurred from sexual violation that is delineated in these texts. So instead of glamorizing sexual violence, these novels present an alternative narrative focus that educates the uninformed reader and provides affirmation to those survivors seeking an empathetic community. So I'd like to turn to Bharti Mukherjee's Jasmine, a novel that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in order to explain what is done differently in this 1989 text than in previous texts. So Bharti Mukherjee offers a more qualified portrayal of a victim survivor whose attempts to ignore her traumatic past prevent her from making sustained emotional connections. So let's move to the middle of the novel where the rape scene occurs. So when I talk about this novel, I call the main character Jay. Then, you know, her name is Jasmine, Jyoti, Jace, and Jane throughout the novel, all J names. And since she switches identities so often, I don't want to prioritize any one identity, so I call her J instead. So after J loses her husband to a terrorist bomb, she leaves India in order to commit sati at the engineering school in Florida, where her husband Prakash was meant to study. Using falsified documents, Jay makes her way to Europe, and she meets a man named Half-Face, who is the captain of the boat that carries her to the United States. Once in Florida, Half-Face sees Jay walking down the highway with her suitcase and offers her a ride to the nearby hotel where he lives. He denies responsibility for the rape before it begins, his words signaling his intention to have sex with her regardless of her wishes. Unlocking the door to the motel room, he says, "Note, you are entering because you want to, no coercion involved." Inside the motel room, Jay does not respond to Half-Face's caresses and instead tells him about her husband, eventually begging, "Please don't do anything to me." Half-Face's response is to smash her head against a television screen, pull off her clothes, and violently rape her. Afterward, Jay walks to the bathroom and Half-Face calls after her, "Don't take all night, second time's the sweetest." In the bathroom, faced with the inevitability of another rape, Jay pulls out a small knife and considers killing herself. But instead, she slices her tongue to drip blood from her mouth, assuming the role of Kali, the goddess of destruction. She returns to the bedroom to slit the throat of the dozing man, and then she stabs him to death. She leaves the motel after burning her suitcase, no longer intending to commit sati. Instead, she sheds her previous identity to create a new life in America. In later chapters, Mukherjee refers to her character's experience as rape specifically, and Jay herself spends significant emotional energy trying to put the violent experience behind her. So when I first started studying this book 15 years ago, I was really interested that most of the literary critics were calling this rape a metaphorical way of seeing the first world and the third world, right? It's a very graphic scene, very specifically described violation of this young girl's body, and yet critics didn't want to see it that way. They wanted to see it metaphorically. And of course we can do that. That's what literature tells us to do, is to read beyond what happens. But Mukherjee portrays the rape in such a way that demands not only a metaphorical, but also a bodily understanding of sexual violence. So the details of this assault educates readers about rape and the traumatic repercussions that haunt victim survivors for years afterward. Foremost, Mukherjee dispels the myth that the woman should have seen her assault coming or prevented its occurrence. Some readers may be troubled that Jay even entered the motel room, for does this mean that she had relinquished her right to say no to sex? Yet Mukherjee's detailed portrayal of Jay's traumatic experience, both before and during the rape, explains her actions and demonstrates the logic behind her responses. Jay's traumatic experience, in fact, begins before she enters the motel room with Half-Face, which explains why she could not stop the events, either physically by leaving the motel or verbally by insisting that she did not want to have sex. Specifically, Jay suffers from several symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which prevent her from protecting herself. And psychiatrist Judith Herman explains that traumatic events generally involve threats to life or bodily injury, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. These include being taken by surprise, trapped, or exposed to the point of exhaustion. In each instance, the salient characteristic of the traumatic event is its power to inspire helplessness and terror. So Jay has experienced traumatic violence even before Half-Face rapes her. First, she survives the bombing that kills her husband. So in this scene, she's in a sari shop with her husband, and a man puts a bomb hidden in a radio that goes off. And the explosion kills her husband, Prakash, but not her. And the two of them fall to the ground together. He is dead, she is alive. And this scene is narrated in first person and in the present. It goes from being narrated in the past tense to the present tense. And this is important because the survivor, Jay, is reliving the event as if it is constantly recurring in the present. So she can't put it into her past. This traumatic event of almost dying herself and of dying in her husband's, and her husband dying in her arms, is a very much a present tense event for her. She says, instant replay in slow motion. I can't turn the VCR off, right? And uses very, very vivid sensations and images. So in addition to the violent death of her husband, other traumatic episodes render this girl vulnerable to Half-Face's attack. And these are the unnarrated rapes that she suffers on her journey to India, from India to America. These rapes occur when Jay is both trapped and exposed to the point of exhaustion, as she travels on charter planes, bribes customs guards, and improvises the next steps of her route along other underground travelers. She sends others to buy her food, saying, "Bring me tea, an orange, bread." Her physical deprivation and vulnerability, provoked by exposure and exhaustion, lead to, quote, the numbed surrender to various men for the reward of an orange, a blanket, a slice of cheese. The repetition of the orange in these two passages demonstrates a connection between Jay's physical needs for sustenance and the conditions that result in the rapes. And she says that she has been raped in boats and cars and motel rooms. So in the book, we see the motel room scene, but we don't see cars and we don't see boats, right? These things happen, but they're not narrated directly. So in order to continue her journey west, Jay must survive, must ingest food, must repel cold with a blanket, and therefore must live through the sexual violations that allow her to survive. So in connecting survival and sexual assault, Mukherjee underscores the place of rape in the lives of disempowered women, especially those migratory women with little control over their circumstances. So when she enters the motel room with Half-Face, she's unable to resist the impending attack physically or verbally, right? So Half-Face slams her head into the television screen, and instead of fighting back, she just goes numb, right? And this is another symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. She has the opportunity to try to run away because after Half-Face slams her head into the TV screen, he goes through her suitcase and she's sitting on the bed doing nothing. And so this seems like, why didn't she run away, right? But she can't fight and she can't try to escape because she is so traumatized by her previous experiences with violence and sexual assault that she is just numbed into a state of surrender. She does try one last verbal resistance when Half-Face is taking her pants off. She says, "Please don't do anything to me." But of course he does. And And so right after he rapes her, she thinks of suicide because she knows that Half-Face will rape her again once she leaves the bathroom. But at this point, she's no longer numb. She's no longer surrendering to the violence. Instead, she experiences the traumatic symptom called reenactment, where trauma survivors repeat the traumatic situation, sometimes unconsciously, but other times with the hope of changing the outcome of the dangerous encounter. So Jay has been raped many times, and she's about to be raped again. And the unresolved feelings of terror and rage that she has numbed herself against inspire her to slice her tongue and become the goddess Kali, who is often portrayed with blood pouring from her mouth. She enters the bedroom with the knife in her hand and slits the throat of her rapist. So she also, she re-scripts the outcome of this specific trauma, but then she also destroys her old life by burning her suitcase and coming into America and taking a new life. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead because I think I've put too much into this presentation, and I want to be able to talk about the 1990s and then what happens in the 21st century as well. Okay, so 1980s, we have this wonderful education of readers, but by the time we get to the 1990s, American readers were tired of the subject of rape and sexual violence and incest. Instead, they wanted to see a different perspective. So instead of lots of graphic realism, we have a fragmentary narration of sexual violence. And in the 1990s, we see novels such as Toni Morrison's Beloved, Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres, and Sapphire's Push that demonstrate how the portrayal of rape and incest echoes the pattern of trauma experienced by their characters in their complicated narration and in their lack of tidy resolution. So as readers, we like a tidy ending that wraps everything up, and these novels do not give us this tidy ending. We have to do a lot of work ourselves in order to understand what's going on in the novel, and also to figure out what's going to happen in the future for these characters. These characters do not die. They go on and have life after rape, and they work to change the American culture. Another important aspect of these novels are that we get information about dead rape victims, those people who cannot tell the stories themselves because they have been killed or die or kill themselves because of the violence that they have experienced. So a novel such as Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones is narrated by a 14-year-old girl who is raped and murdered in the first chapter. So the amazing thing about this novel is that the author lets her consciousness continue and imagines what it must be like for this girl to have been murdered. Okay, so wrapping up, the last chapter of my book talks about the impact of the rape novel in the 21st century. So we've seen stories of women from 1970 through the beginning of the 21st century. Now, the rape novel begins to tell the stories of men who have been raped, right? Previously, men were imagined only as the rapists, only as the man who is perpetuating the violence upon women. And if there were scenes of rape against men in novels in American literature, the men were feminized. They were seen as weak or as woman-like. So a novel such as James Dickey's Deliverance from 1970 showed rape in graphic detail, but blamed the victim for his rape and turned him into more of a boy, a child, a feminized body. Another novel that you'll be familiar with is Khaled Hossani's The Kite Runner from 2003, which revolves around Amir witnessing his half-brother Hassan being raped by a teenager named Asif. And it's his lifelong shame that he does nothing to stop this rape from happening. So our author, Khaled Hossani, allows the whole trajectory of the novel to be Amir's penance to his half-brother who has died but has left behind a son who is also being sexually assaulted by the same man. So the bystander, Amir, who did nothing, now is the one making sure to give justice to the rape victims, to the child. So the very end here, today's rape novels are telling the stories of men, are telling the stories of gender fluid survivors, of transgender survivors, etc. And you'll notice that my book is called Writing the Survivor, right? We started out with rape victims, but by today, 50 years later, we have rape survivors. Now, of course, not everyone is a survivor. Those people who die are not survivors. But the cultural shift has allowed people to embrace the idea that they can survive rape, they should not be ashamed of rape, and that they can go on and have a very fulfilling life after being raped. And the goal of the rape novel has been to make sure that justice comes to the victims, that the community is sympathetic, and that rape ends for everyone. So I hope that my telling you about this new genre of the rape novel, which is not, of course, only in American literature, it is in world literature as well. I hope this offered you some new insights into American literature, and I'd be happy to take questions at this point. All right. Professor Doss, how shall we?
Hello, Robin.
Hello.
So it's a very illuminating. Yes. Hello.
Sir, are you going to ask the questions?
Okay. Carry on then.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Field, for this wonderful session. And here we have got a few questions. So should I ask you?
Yes.
Okay. Ma'am, as per the first question, there's a question. Can you discuss how does the cover of your upcoming book break the stereotypes of the rape victim?
Very good question. Yes. So I was very concerned about making sure the cover of my book was not a violent image. I did not want violence to be the focus. Believe it or not, I wanted hope. I wanted positivity. I wanted the idea of the survivor to come forth in my book. And so as I was looking for a piece of art to put on the cover, I was searching the internet using the term survivor. And in fact, I found this image by an artist in Delhi, and she does watercolors, and I asked her if I could use this image, and she gave me permission. I'm very grateful to her. I like this image because it does look like a woman, but it's also fairly gender neutral, which allows us to imagine survivors being men, being women, being gender fluid people. The colors are not violent, like not with the reds and yellows and blacks. The blues, the purples, those colors are much more positive, and it allows the person on the cover to also, I think, have a very positive sense of self, right? A very self-assured, self-contained image. And so that was really important to me, to show that this was not a book that when you read it, you're just going to be depressed all the time, right? It's a book that shows how social activism can change culture, how reading literature can change the culture, right? So women who were not activists themselves, but were going to the library and reading a novel could learn and change their minds in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And then today, we can read stories about male rape victims and realize that they are suffering in the same way as female rape victims and need the same support and need the same justice. So that is a long answer for why I chose this image.
Okay,
Okay, thank you, Dr. Field.
may I add, Robin? That is what I think is that this webinar that we have organized will also, in that sense, act as a kind of, paving the way for coming out from the kind of closet that these rape victims or other survivors of different kinds of atrocity inflicted upon them can come forward and live a kind of normal life if the
Absolutely.
culture and the society becomes much more empathetic. So that is also the reason why we organize this kind of thing. And I thank you for being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and I know that, so about 5 or 6 years ago, a graphic novel came out called Priya's Shakti in India that is showing the young girl who is raped as one who can turn into a goddess and have justice and be admired and be a heroine for other children and change the way that rape is looked at. And so that is such an important aspect of literature for everyone. And so we see this happening worldwide, in America, in India, in other countries as well.
Don't do that, carry on.
Yes, yes, sir. Okay, ma'am. So the next question is from Bhashwati Bhattacharjee. Stanley Kubrick's film Clockwork Orange depicts a brutally graphic rape scene because of which a few actresses refused to play the role of the victim character, Mrs. Alexander. So, ma'am, do you think that such detailed depiction of rape in art and literature is itself humiliating for women?
Yes, that I know that scene, and I remember watching it and being really horrified by it. In part because the music that is set to that scene turns it into a joke. It's a piece of classical music, and I can't remember the name or the composer, but it's also sped up in time. So the characters go very fast through their actions. And yes, as viewers of this film, we're put in that voyeuristic position to enjoy this. We're not there to feel horror, or if we do feel horror, we're still noticing other aspects of, as I said, the humor of the music, that disconnect between the horror and what is going on the screen. And so, yeah, Kubrick, in doing this scene, was contributing to the culture that I'm saying that the rape novel is pushing against. Another film in American literature or American culture where the same sort of thing happens is Pulp Fiction. There is a rape scene against a man, and a very catchy pop song is played over the rape scene. And the director of that film, Quentin Tarantino, was saying it was just so funny to have this music put over this violent scene. It turns the whole thing into a joke. Somebody's violent experience turns into something to laugh at. And that contributes to the dehumanization of the victim, right? It does not allow him or her to be a person. And so these novels fight back against this. And then there are certainly films in the canon now that also fight back against this. films are very challenging not to be voyeuristic and pornographic and suggestive, right? With novels, we can at least use our own imaginations to fight back against what is on the page and say, nope, I'm not going to see this as funny or exciting or pornographic. I'm going to see this as a violation. And I respect those actresses who decided not to be in that scene because it is not a good scene.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Field. One more question we have selected. That is, in Jhumpar Lahiri's novel, The Interpreter of Maladies, the treatment of Bibi Haldar, a hysterical 29-year-old woman, is mysteriously raped someone, mysteriously raped someone, and her only guardian, that is her cousin Haldar, and his wife gone away, mysteriously leaving her. And when baby is born out of that, she is ultimately cured at the end. Uh, at the end, this story doesn't show any deep psychological concern or trauma, but rather shows her independence after that. So, what is your take on it?
Yeah, that's a very complicated text. I do find it positive that Lahiri did not show the rape scene. And in fact, the very complication in the story that we don't know who the father of the child is and the circumstances of the conception makes us think deeply, right? It makes us imagine this rape, and we realize too, if this is a woman who has a mental deficiency, we know that she cannot consent, right? That she should not be having sexual relations, even if she supposedly wanted to have sexual relations. And so in a way, we're already at a place where we can see the negativity of the rape without having to have it portrayed. I would also say that the fact that Bibi turns into a happy mother afterward is a continuation of the survivor narrative, right? That being raped didn't mean that she was going to have a terrible life moving on thereafter. In fact, for her, I don't like the idea of it being a cure. I think that's very problematic as well. But the idea that she can embrace motherhood and love her child shows that women can survive and live on in very positive ways and not be destroyed by the experience. And I think it also challenges so you'll notice that the bystanders are the ones observing Bibi in this story, right? And so it challenges us readers as bystanders to think about, well, who in this world would do this to her? And what should we as bystanders do about it, right? When we as readers think about these questions, hopefully by the time we encounter something in our lives, if that happens, if we know someone who has experienced rape, if we find somebody in our own lives, we will treat them appropriately. We will seek out justice if at all possible, but we will also support the person's recovery and having a positive life later. So one of the most important aspects I've found about this genre, the rape novel, has been in the way they transform us as readers, all right? The literature has transformed, but we as readers can go and be better people in the real world because of the way these novels teach us about something that may never happen to us, but happens to so many other people. And so it's important for us to understand how to deal with it and not to put stereotypes or negative judgments on other people who experience this. Very good question.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Field, for your marvelous speech. It's a privilege on our part to have you among us and listen to your perspectives and thoughts. And I'm sure all our listeners, all the participants over here, and we, the faculties of our department, are enriched a lot, have been enriched a lot today. So I thank you once again, Dr. Field. And I thank all the participants over there who have been so much patient in enjoying our session. And I would request you all to wait for the next session. That is our third and last session today of our today's webinar. And the link for the feedback form will be provided in the chat box and the WhatsApp group as well. So please fill it up and wait after the last session is over, because the feedback will be taken after that only. So thank you, Dr. Field. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It has been my deep pleasure to speak with you today. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I hope your next session goes very well.
Thank you so much. It's our pleasure, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.